Hello and welcome back to another episode of Record Live. It is amazing to have my co-host Anita here with me again today, and we're joined today by Pastor David Riley. Pastor Dave, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Thanks, Anita. Thanks for having me.
Now, this conversation has come about in some ways because you've got a book that you're releasing shortly. It's called Bubsie and the Boys. And I thought we could start just with an intro. What is the book about and why did you write it? Why is it a passion project of yours?
Well, look, 4 or 5 years ago, my wife and I had a conversation and our three kids about taking some time off from professional ministry and doing something that thousands of people do every year, tens of thousands have done in the past, lots more have it on their bucket list, and that's to do a lap of Australia. We bought a caravan, we hooked up our four-wheel drive, and so we set out in 2021 on a what was to be a 12-month adventure around Australia. It turned out to be 2 years. My wife says to me that was my plan all along. I just needed to gradually introduce it to the topic. And our kids at the time were early teens, three children, and it was just a fabulous experience, wonderful experience of spending time with family, connecting with church people around the country, meeting new people, wonderful adventures, great walks, snorkeling, and all of those things that people think when they imagine doing a big lap around Australia. And it's that lap around Australia and exploring this wonderful continent we have has become one of the great road trips of the world. Thousands of people come in from abroad each year, backpackers and other traveling families that, we met some along the way, and it is one of the great road trips of the world. And I was sitting on a beach with an old friend who worked at Carmel College, our school there in the Perth Hills in Western Australia. And as my kids, played in the water with his kids, and we sat on the beach enjoying the autumn sunshine, he was sharing with me a little bit about this story. I'd never heard this story before, that the fact that two young 21-year-old students from Carmel College, back when it was a tertiary institution 100 years ago, had taken this tiny little car and without any maps, without any regular roads around the country, no regular petrol stations as people who do it today are used to. They had circled Australia without initially planning to. They were just going out on an errand for the church. And I was just enamored with this story. It's the origin story, the genesis of what has become one of the great, road trips of the world. And so I asked him more questions. He had some archive stuff. He shared it with me. And over the next year or so, as I read more, I thought, look, there needs to be a comprehensive book written on this story. And so that's Bubsie and the Boys. That's the kind of how it came to be.
I think Bubsie and the Boys is a great title. I always am sold by alliterated titles, but I read in just the bio of your book that you said the vehicle had less horsepower than a modern day lawnmower, which is wild. But was it those kind of interesting elements that drew you to want to share the story, or was it something deeper? Because I know there's also themes of like purpose and of ordinary people doing incredible things. What was kind of the thing that you were like, I really want to get this out there and I really want to share this message?
Yeah, look, it's a combination of some of those things you just described, Anita, and one or two others. I love, just in my own life, opportunities for travel and adventure. Some of the great stories of Scripture Paul's, the Apostle Paul's missionary trips are great stories of travel and adventure, faith-based travel and adventure. I also have a love of the Australian outback, the deep blue skies, the red dirt, the wonderful sounds of the birds. And, so that, the travel and adventure combined with, with the outback of Australia, combined with stories of, and you mentioned sort of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And it's not just the two young lads that borrowed one of their brother's cars and, that's a tiny little vehicle. It's the people that they meet along the way, their stories interacting with other stories. And those stories are both inspiring. Some of them are a little sad. And also, their interaction with Australia's First Nations people from 100 years ago, and seeing some of the difficulties that our Indigenous people experienced back then 100 years ago, and still experience today. And so it was. Whilst it's a story from 100 years ago, I think it also talks to us today in terms of our own individual situation, but also our circumstances as a nation.
So Bubsie in the title refers to the car. That's the nickname of the little Citroen that they drove around Australia. So the boys are the young men. Can you tell us their names and a little bit about the two young men that did this trip? Were they? Yeah, it sounds like they were very young. You said they were going on an errand, which turned into a trip around Australia. That's an epic sort of detour, I guess you could say. Can you tell us a little bit about the boys in Bubsie and the Boys?
Yeah, sure, Ken. So let's start with the car. It's a tiny little Citroen Cabriolet 2-seater. The car now sits in the National Museum of Australia as a vehicle of national significance. Of their 150 cars, or 150-ish cars that they have in their collection there in Canberra, Bubsie, and we'll get to the nickname in a moment, is one of their favourites, because it just looks fabulous. It's tiny. The kids love it when they see it. It reminds them of, I don't know whether, Jared, you ever saw the cartoon car Brum when you were younger, whether you watched those cartoons. It reminds yes. a lot of people of Brum. And it's one of the National Museum's favourite cars because it starts every time. And their curators say that they have a lot of modern cars. Like, for example, the last Holden Commodore to roll off the production line, and a lot of the cars over the last 50 years, they struggle to get started whenever they have a car event there, because they've got to hook up computers and the technology's aging, and but there's a simplicity around Bubsie that just starts every time and lends itself 100 years ago, this utilitarian nature of the car. It was just simple. It started every time. It lent itself, in an ironic way, to traveling around the continent on, cattle tracks and across deserts. The car was originally marketed and manufactured by Citroën there in France for women to, tootle around cobblestone streets in Europe for afternoon tea, and aperitifs. And so here is this car that was originally designed that they thought for women to spend, 15 minutes traveling down to the local cafe. And here is this extraordinary small vehicle with two strapping 21-year-olds circumnavigating the country, circumnavigating the continent down here in Australia. So I find that quite a funny little little side note. So the two young blokes, 21 years old when they started out, were Neville Westwood and Greg Davies. They had met at Carmel College. Greg was still studying at Carmel College. He was hoping to be a teacher in our school network. Neville had recently graduated. He was working as what we would call today an intern. He was a minister's assistant. And Neville, the year prior to setting out on this adventure in 2025, Neville had been selling books, colporteuring, up in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. He rode a motorbike around that huge area that we know today because it's famous for mining. And he had sold books around the towns and camps around that region. And Neville had heard that there was a church initiative to look at establishing a missionary outpost up in Darwin. The Seventh-day Adventist Church didn't have any representation up there in Darwin, and that initiative had been on the table for a couple of years, but nothing was happening. And so Neville approached his boss and said, "Look, I think we could maybe, travel up to Darwin by car." No one had ever travelled from Perth to Darwin by car before, but he knew from the previous year's experience, he knew it was possible. And he said, "I think I can convince my older brother to loan us his car. And if I get my mate Greg from Carmel College, maybe both of us could travel from Perth up to Darwin, 4,000 kilometres, and we'll sell books along the way." And that's what they did. They had a couple of samples in their tiny little boot at the rear of the car, and they would stop at cattle stations and small towns along the way, show their books, take orders, send those orders back to Perth by letter, and then the Perth office would ship those to the customers later on. And so they sold books along the way. They also raised a little bit of money for what we know today as ADRA. So they were raising money for charity, and their trip even from Perth to Darwin was an extraordinary, act of pioneering and of adventure and overcoming significant adversity to get this tiny car all the way from Perth up to Darwin.
So crazy. You mentioned that you were going to explain where the name Bubsie came from. Can you go into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, thanks for the reminder there, Zanita. So when Citroën put this model out, they called it a baby Citroën, or in French, a petite Citroën. Excuse my poor pronunciation there. Petite Citroën in English actually means little lemon, which is not a great name for a car. So they kind of Australianized it. In Australia, the Citroën importers referred to it as a baby Citroën. And so the nickname that Neville's family gave it, of course, coming from baby Citroën, was Bubsie. So that's how the name came about, and it kind of just stuck. And these particular model Citroëns, for collectors who have them today, often just refer to them as the Bubsie car.
Wow. I'm glad you cleared up also how they took orders for the books and had them posted or whatever, because I was wondering how this tiny car, they fit so much stock into it. How did they bring all the books and the petrol? Because you said there weren't frequent petrol stops, so they would have had to carry tanks and things of spare petrol to get anywhere, I imagine.
Yeah, the petrol tank only held about 19 litres of fuel. It's just a little tiny little tank that sits underneath the dashboard. But Neville's dad worked for Sir Sidney Kidman, who was a famous person of the cattle stations from 100 years ago. He was known back in the day as the Cattle King. And so Neville had grown up working in various cattle stations around the country, traveling with his family. So as a kid, so he kind of knew station culture, and he'd often pull into a cattle station, drop a few names. The cattle stations and sheep stations back then loved having visitors. As you read in the in the book Bubsie and the Boys, it was just common for the cattle and sheep station homesteads to take any visitor that turned up at their doorstep, and often it was at sundown, that they'd have visitors, and so visitors were often known as sundowners because they'd arrive. The homestead would give them a meal, a bed for the night, and then these travelers would move on. And so Neville knew that, and so they would stop at these cattle stations. Often the cattle stations would either give them fuel or sell them fuel, and that way they were able to keep on going. But it's a wonderful. Often in our travels today, we want to make sure that we've got everything scheduled. We've got all of our bookings and and accommodation sorted, and where are the stops. That we have the whole itinerary planned. But here are two young lads setting out on something that no one had ever done before, and just stepping out in faith, knowing or feeling confident that things would just work out along the way as they traveled along.
Incredible. I love that. I guess releasing a book, I'm sure, has been like an exciting thing for you, maybe also a relieving thing, because it can be quite a process. And I feel like, I don't know, I guess it's been like sandwiched between some really difficult things in your own personal life as well, like some really tragic things. Have you found that like the excitement of this story and of writing the book has kind of helped you navigate, I guess, those like circumstances in your life? Or how is it like, I don't know, how has it been to write a book in such a hectic period of your life?
Yeah, I think like with anything, if God places something on your heart, there are things that come along the way that are obstacles, and some of them are significant, Zanita. But if you just kind of, do a little bit each day, the story or the journey progresses. I mean, anyone who's and some of your listeners have written things before or created something, and so the discipline is just to kind of do something every day. And I think in a personal application that can relate to even our relationship with God. There are some things that happen in our life that are really, really difficult. But if we just simply kind of make the effort to even just to pray, just to connect with our Creator each day, our own journey with our own travels and our own progress in terms of our relationship with God just improves and increases with each day that comes. And so in the same way, I think that, writing this book through some difficult things, including, the death of our eldest daughter earlier this year from brain cancer, the key there is just to kind of, even through those struggles, do a little bit every day.
The young men in the story obviously demonstrated great faith, and you said they didn't have a worry, and I imagine that they some of that was trusting in God and just showing up, getting through those struggles. Now, you mentioned the tragic loss of your daughter, and yeah, when I heard about that, to have a life lost so young, it really hits, especially because I've got young children at the moment. It's like, wow, I don't even know how I would survive a situation like that. But now you've been diagnosed with cancer as well yourself, and the diagnosis, as I understand, is not good. How do you find that faith with, like the boys did, for yourself, going through something that's very, very difficult? I know it would be easy for some of us to, I guess, get angry at God or wrestle with God. Is there some of that going on for you, or is it like just going, well, God's got it under control and I've got to let go of that control? Like, how does that look? How do you navigate that? And I guess it goes up and to be, if you don't mind sharing that with us. Like, how do you see that in your own personal faith?
Yeah. There's a lot to your questions there, Jared. So I'll let me see if I can do my best to answer a couple of those questions that you raised. So yes, so Jessica, our 17-year-old daughter, year 12 this year, in the first week of school, started showing severe headaches and symptoms. She was hospitalized and diagnosed there at the end of February with an aggressive brain cancer, and died in the middle in May. So it was 3 months, a little bit less than 3 months between sort of diagnosis and death. And we, for those of you, your audience that have lost people close to them, especially children, that it is obviously a tragic and life-altering experience. We miss Jess, my wife, and our remaining 2 kids, and our broader family miss Jessica every single day, miss her deeply. And I can only assume we will for the rest of our lives. But we have this wonderful hope that we will see our loved ones again. It's the great promise of Christ that he has the keys to death. And it's that hope that, allows us to navigate through these kinds of tragedies. It kind of comes as a bit of a shock to some of our family and some of our church community that only a couple of months after Jess's death that I've received a diagnosis. My cancer is a bit different. It's pancreatic cancer that has, well, I'm told we're still doing some more testing at the moment. So the doctors are pretty certain it's pancreatic cancer. And for those who know a bit about cancer, there's not a great survival rate there. But it's also already metastasized to multiple parts of my body. And so I'm told by those who know better than me that it's terminal. And that might come as a bit of a shock to some so soon after Jess's death. But what we learned when Jess was ill was that Jessica and I shared a very rare genetic syndrome that doesn't allow our bodies to suppress cancer. And so it's a little bit of a minor miracle, Jared and Zanita, that I've lived this long, as I've discovered. And I feel incredibly grateful for the life I've lived. The Lord has given me. We're talking about travel and adventure before. The Lord has given me a life of travel and adventure, and I feel, and not just geographical travel and adventure, but adventure in ministry. And so I feel very grateful for that. I even see that. The blessing of being able to see Jessica through to her end of life. I'm not quite sure. I've used the word a privilege or a blessing or an honor, and those words don't quite capture it just yet. But I do feel honored to have to have seen Jess through to the end of her life with. With the reassurance for our family that we'll see her again. One of the last things she said to us, as we read scripture to her, one of the last things that Jess said to us was, "It is well with my soul." And that's a strange thing, isn't it, for a 17-year-old to quote an ancient hymn, an old hymn. And that was incredibly comforting to know that her faith was strong, and my faith is strong as well. I feel I've seen many blessings over the last 6 months with Jess's illness and now my diagnosis, and it only confirms to me that we need to live every single day that we're given with a sense of excitement, a sense of adventure, and do the most with every opportunity we're given.
Yeah. I think what I'm kind of hearing is that even though all of this is super unfortunate and heartbreaking, there's a lot of timely things. Like you mentioned that your family did a massive lap of Australia and went traveling together, and fortunately you got to do that before either of you became unwell. And what a blessing I'm sure that was. And I think, often when people receive some kind of diagnosis, that is when they go into like the live big mentality and like, let's tick off our bucket list items now, with whatever time they have left. But it's awesome that you've kind of been able to do that with your life up until now. But I don't know, were there any, I guess because you've written that book hand in hand with a lot of these experiences unfolding, has there anything come from like the book or the story of these boys traveling around? Maybe their trials are uncomparable to your own, but that has kind of like helped you in these like experiences or in these hard times.
Yeah. So Zanita, behind me, I've got a little bit of a picture wall we're putting together of just some of the photos of our family's travels around Australia. And you're right, we didn't know it at the time. A couple of years ago when we made the decision to take some time out and travel with our kids, we didn't know it as we were doing it, that we would be at this point now and feel so glad that we had those experiences. And so, without getting too kind of West Coast American motivational speaker on you, Zanita and Jared, it's just a reminder to just to take every opportunity today, that we have, not to put things off for a later time. Have that conversation, with your neighbor across the road or the family member you're estranged with. To have those experiences with family and friends. And I think the carpenter of Nazareth said it, didn't he, in the Sermon on the Mount? Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow has enough worries of its own. All we have is today. Just enjoy the blessings of each day that we're given. So So I'm not sure that answers your question, but what I am mindful of, that in writing this book, and some of your audience, Zanita and Jared, will know elements of this story as it's been told in various forms over the last 100 years, and with this year being the centenary of their achievement. This story is kind of being reminded to us. I've trawled through a bunch of dusty, archive boxes, both within the church, but also in other parts of Australia as well. And so I've endeavored to tell this story honestly and truthfully. And there are parts of this story that I actually find sad. And so it may surprise when people read this book, in being honest about these two young fellas that achieved this this wonderful, this thing that they did. There are elements where you'll recognize their humanity. They weren't, they weren't saints that were sinless at all. They were two young fellas out on an adventure, but there was still humanity to them. And it's a reminder to me that even in our own, sinfulness, even in our own humanity, even in our own ordinariness, that, if we set out on something we feel God placing on our heart, we can overcome any obstacle placed in our way, and ordinary people can do extraordinary things with the help of their Creator.
I'm kind of torn, David, because we're running out of time here, and I've got two questions that are sort of front of mind, and I'm like, which one do I ask? Maybe I'll ask them both, and you can just give us a quick sort of answer through there. You are a pastor, and you've probably preached a lot of sermons in your life, and I myself, as a writer, have often thought, if I had to give one last message to people, you know, a sermon or an article or something that I could provide, what would be the core of that message? And then I guess on the book front as well, who's the book for? Who's the audience that you intended when you were writing this book?
Yeah. Let me answer that second question first, Jared. So yes, the book is quite a lengthy book, and I'm aware that, you know, people, I'm told anyway, aren't reading much anymore. I kind of disagree. I think they're reading, but in different forms. You know, well-told stories. There is always going to be an audience somewhere for a story that's well told, and I'm hoping, Jared, that the story is in this book, Bubsie and the Boys, is well told. But I've written it. You know, I had a couple of mates in mind. You know, not Christians, not Adventists, obviously, blokes who, and I've thought, what, you know, how is a way I can tell this story in a way that engages them. So you've got, you know, travel, adventure, cars. This actual story turns into a race where two other vehicles set out to be the first to lap Australia. These two other vehicles, faster and bigger cars, set out within 24 hours of each other, not knowing that Neville and Greg in Bubsie were already on the road. You know, so the big media event of these two other cars set out. The newspapers didn't even know Bubsie was on the road, and it was only later down the track that they discovered that there was another car out there. And so these two other vehicles start to chase down Bubsie, and it almost, as you read the story, we know the end of the story. Bubsie's obviously becomes the but even those two cars are the people driving those two cars have their own extraordinary story as well. So, you know, we've got these elements of travel, the outback, adventure, you know, crossing rivers, being pulled across by Indigenous women, you know, meeting extraordinary people out there in the outback. And there's even a race, a car chase in there as well. There are fights. There's a number of things there that I kind of thought, what's your average, you know, and to use a cliche, you know, your average Aussie, what's he going to be interested in? And or she, for that matter. And so I've written it for that audience in mind, and hoping that it also gives a soft and warm introduction to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because without the church, this story would never have happened. And so I'm hoping that they'll get into the story, that they'll have a warm introduction to us as a body of believers, and maybe, just maybe, God might place on their heart to maybe find out a little bit more. Maybe.
Awesome.
And then the second part of your question, Jared, was what's the sermon you would preach? Look, I think the sermons in my life that have had the most impact on people, and the sermons I've listened to that have had the most impact on me, are the sermons where you share in an honest and real way how God has spoken to you. And that, if I had one more sermon to preach, it would be how God has blessed me in my life.
Amazing. Dave, you mentioned earlier in this conversation that the young men were raising money for ADRA, I believe. And you spoke to us before, and you said that part of the proceeds of this book are also going to support kids' cancer charities. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can people support that in other ways aside from just buying a book, or is buying the book the best way to support that? that charity?
Yeah, so part of the proceeds of Bubsie and the Boys is going to two kids' cancer charities, Canteen and Brainchild. There's a number of wonderful charities that supported us through Jess's illness, and we've kind of picked these two to support for this project. We do have a car that was the sister car to Bubsie. It's called Bubsie 2. It was driven around Australia in 1975 for the 50th anniversary by a team including a famous Citroen rally car driver at the time. We have that book, and it was our intention this year for the centenary to drive that car around Australia on the original route that Neville and Greg took in the original Bubsie. But with Jess's illness and death, we've obviously had to delay that. That drive next year is going to go ahead. We're driving the car with a couple of other support cars along the way, but the car is actually going to be driven on the original route. That's the plan. And we'll stop along the way to tell the story in various places, maybe sell some books and raise some money again for Canteen and Brainchild. And so if any of your audience, would like to, there are some fabulous charities that support kids and families going through this experience. Canteen and Brainchild are one, but you've also got Red Kite, the Mark Hughes Foundation. I'm talking to you from Newcastle, and the Mark Hughes Foundation is a Newcastle-based brain cancer charity. But look, there's multiple charities out there that do some fabulous work helping families through these difficult circumstances.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. We'll put those links in the comments for anyone who wants to support them. And your book as well, Bubsie and the Boys, The First Journey Around Australia by Car. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. I know many people have been saddened by the news of your daughter and now your diagnosis as well. So we'll definitely keep that in prayer. But yeah, also feeling excited about the release of this awesome book.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks, Jared.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again on Record Live. God bless.